The chamber of the Galactic Concord was ancient beyond measure. Its walls were carved from living crystal that hummed with the weight of 10,000 judgments, and the air itself felt heavy with the gravity of decisions that had shaped empires. Commander Lisa Grant stood at the center of this impossible space, feeling very small and very human beneath the towering figures that surrounded her. The delegation occupied the eastern platform, their massive reptilian forms casting long shadows across the polished floor. Warlord stood at their head, his hide telling stories of countless battles won through raw violence. His yellow eyes fixed on the human delegation with undisguised contempt, and when he spoke, his voice rumbled like thunder across distant mountains. "The evidence is clear," declared, sweeping one clawed hand toward the holographic display floating between them. Human vessels entered the disputed zone and extracted minerals from 3 asteroids. This is a violation of the Neutral Territory Accord. The punishment must be severe. Lisa kept her expression neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She had known this moment was coming for weeks, ever since the mining ships had strayed into contested space during a navigation error. They had been waiting for any excuse to challenge humanity's expanding presence in this sector, and now they had won. Ambassador Cole stood at her shoulder, his young face betraying none of the fear that Lisa knew he must be feeling. He had only been in the diplomatic corps for 2 years, but he had proven himself sharp and quick-thinking. Right now, she needed both qualities desperately. "The incursion was accidental," said, his voice steady. "Our navigation systems experienced a malfunction. We have offered full compensation for any resources extracted." Warlord laughed, and the sound was like rocks grinding together. "Compensation? You think credits can erase the insult? Human ships crawled through our territory like vermin, taking what does not belong to them. The Dominion demands the surrender of the entire corridor. Nothing less will satisfy our honor." Lisa felt stiffen beside her. The corridor was home to 3 human colony worlds and nearly 50 million people. Surrendering it would be unthinkable, a death sentence for the communities that had spent generations building lives there. "That demand is absurd," Lisa said, stepping forward. "You cannot expect us to abandon millions of civilians over a minor border dispute." "Then we are at an impasse," said, and his smile revealed rows of serrated teeth. "Unless you prefer to settle this through other means." The chamber fell silent. Every species present understood what the warlord was suggesting. The ancient laws of the Galactic Concord allowed for disputes to be resolved through ritual combat when diplomatic solutions failed. It was a provision that dated back to the founding of the Concord itself, a way to prevent full-scale wars between member species. High Arbiter stirred on the central platform. The Ancient had presided over the Concord for longer than most species had possessed space travel, and her compound eyes reflected the light of 1,000 legal precedents. When she spoke, her voice clicked and buzzed in a way that the translation devices rendered as cold authority. "The invocation of ritual combat is within their rights," declared. "Commander Grant, does humanity accept or refuse?" Lisa closed her eyes for a moment. Refusing would mean accepting the terms, surrendering the corridor and everyone in it. Accepting meant fighting under rules she did not yet understand. Neither option seemed survivable. "What are the terms?" she asked. A smile widened. "Combat shall take place on the sacred proving grounds of Prime. Each side may field up to 20 warriors. The engagement continues until one side surrenders or is eliminated. And of course, all weapons must comply with the Treaty of Neutral Engagement." Leaned close to Lisa's ear. "The treaty bans any weapon containing electronic components, energy cells, chemical propellants, or synthetic materials. It was written before most species developed projectile weapons. They have been fighting with blades and pole arms for. We would be slaughtered." Lisa heard the despair in his voice, and she understood it. Humanity had conquered the stars with plasma rifles and rail guns, with missiles and powered armor. Strip all of that away and what remained? They were twice the size of humans, faster, stronger, and trained from birth in close combat. They had never lost a ritual engagement in their entire history. But something stirred in the back of Lisa's mind. A memory from her academy days, from a history course she had taken as an elective. Humans had not always fought with technology. Before the guns and the bombs, before the tanks and the aircraft, there had been other weapons. Older weapons. Weapons that required no electricity, no chemicals, no synthetic materials at all. "We accept," Lisa said, and the words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Blinked, clearly surprised. He had expected negotiation, pleading, perhaps even an attempt to flee. Acceptance was not something he had prepared for. "You understand what you are agreeing to?" he asked. "Your soft bodies against steel, your weakness against our strength." Lisa met his gaze without flinching. "I understand perfectly, but I require 72 hours to prepare my warriors and transport them here." High Arbiter consulted briefly with her attendants before nodding her angular head. "This is acceptable. Both parties will return to this chamber in 72 standard hours. May the proving grounds reveal the truth." The session ended, and the delegates began to disperse. Passed close to Lisa on his way out, looming over her like a mountain of scales and muscle. 72 hours to make peace with your gods," he said quietly. "Use them well, little human." Lisa watched him go, then turned too. The young ambassador looked pale, terrified, and utterly lost. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "We cannot win this. We have nothing that can match them in close combat." Lisa pulled out her communication device and began composing a message. Her fingers moved quickly, typing a single word that she hoped would be understood by the right people back on Earth. "We have exactly what we need," she said. "We just have to remember where we put it." She sent the message and watched it disappear into the void between stars. The word she had sent was simple, old, and full of promise. "Fletcher's" stared at her with confusion written across his face, but Lisa just smiled. Humanity had been killing each other long before they had learned to split atoms or harness plasma. The thought they were facing a species that depended on technology. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The message arrived at Earth Command at 3 in the morning, local time. General was pulled from her bed to read a single word that made no sense to her at all. She stared at it for a long moment, then called her staff together for an emergency briefing. "Fletcher's," she said, projecting the message onto the conference room wall. "Commander Grant sent this from Prime 6 hours ago. She has accepted ritual combat against thee under the Treaty of Neutral Engagement. She has 66 hours remaining to field a combat team." The officers around the table exchanged confused glances. Colonel Hayes, the head of Special Operations, leaned forward with a frown creasing his weathered face. "The treaty bans everything we have," he said. "No electronics, no chemicals, no synthetics. We cannot even bring body armor. What does she expect us to send?" General pulled up the treaty text and read it carefully. The restrictions were absolute. Any weapon containing a circuit, a battery, a chemical propellant, or an artificial material was forbidden. They had designed these rules centuries ago, back when they believed no species could match their physical prowess in melee combat. They had been right, for the most part. "Fletcher's," repeated, rolling the word around in her mind. "Someone look that up." A young lieutenant at the end of the table was already typing. Her eyes widened as she found the answer. "A Fletcher is someone who makes arrows," she said. "It comes from the old French word for arrow. Before firearms, Fletchers were essential craftsmen for any army that used bows." Silence fell over the room. Then Colonel Hayes began to laugh, a deep rumbling sound that built until tears streamed down his cheeks. "Bows and arrows," he said when he could speak again. "She wants us to send bows and arrows." General studied the treaty one more time. Wood was permitted. Animal sinew was permitted. Iron and steel were permitted, as long as they were forged without electronic assistance. Rope, leather, stone, all of these were allowed. The treaty had been written to prevent the use of advanced technology, but its authors had never imagined that any species would willingly return to primitive weapons. "Can it work?" she asked. Hayes wiped his eyes and considered the question seriously. "They are big, strong, and fast. In close combat they would tear us apart, but bows and crossbows are ranged weapons. A good English longbow can send an arrow 300 meters with enough force to punch through plate armor. If we can keep our distance, we might have a chance." "Where do we find people who can actually use these weapons?" another officer asked. Hayes was already on his feet. Historical recreation societies, sport archery leagues. There are people who have dedicated their lives to mastering these old skills. We just need to find them and get them to prime in less than 3 days. The search began within the hour. Military databases were cross-referenced with civilian records, and names began to emerge. Master Sergeant Daniel Perry was the first call. He had won 3 national championships in traditional archery and held a doctorate in military history. When the phone woke him at 4 in the morning, he listened to the explanation for exactly 90 seconds before asking when the transport would arrive. Dr. Bishop was next. She had spent 20 years studying medieval siege weapons and had supervised the construction of working trebuchets for museums around the world. She answered her phone on the first ring, already awake and grading papers. When she heard what was needed, she asked only one question. "How many do you want?" Captain was an engineer who had built catapults and ballistas as a hobby for most of his adult life. He had designed siege engines that could throw stones weighing over 200 kilograms with surprising accuracy. He was on a plane within 2 hours of receiving the call. Lieutenant Maria Santos was an Olympic archer who had narrowly missed the gold medal in her last competition. She had trained with traditional bows since childhood, learning from her grandfather who had learned from his grandfather before him. When the military contacted her, she did not hesitate. The team assembled at a training facility in Montana, where the elevation and terrain most closely matched the descriptions of Prime. 12 warriors in total, chosen for their skill with weapons that had not been used in actual warfare for 500 years. Daniel Perry took command of the training, pushing his team through exercise after exercise. They practiced volley fire, where all archers released their arrows at the same moment to create a deadly rain. They drilled on rapid reloading, on shooting while moving, on judging distance without electronic assistance. Bishop worked with to construct 3 trebuchets from timber, rope, and iron fittings. The machines were beautiful in their simplicity, elegant solutions to the problem of throwing heavy objects over long distances. They tested them again and again, adjusting the counterweights and sling lengths until they could place a stone within a 5-meter circle at 200 meters. Maria Santos trained the archers in precision shooting. She taught them to account for wind and gravity, to breathe properly, to find the calm center that allowed for perfect accuracy. Her arrows flew straight and true, and soon the others were matching her skill. On the second day, the crossbows arrived. These were heavier weapons, slower to reload but more powerful than even the strongest longbow. They required less training to use effectively, and Daniel assigned them to the team members who were better suited to deliberate, careful shooting. The weapons themselves were works of art. The bowyers and craftsmen of Earth had risen to the challenge, producing equipment that would have been the envy of any medieval army. The longbows were made from yew wood, their curves perfected through techniques that dated back to the age of. The crossbows used steel prods and wooden stocks, their mechanisms simple enough to pass any inspection, but powerful enough to punch through armor at 100 meters. On the third day, they loaded everything onto a fast transport and departed for Prime. Daniel stood at the viewport, watching Earth shrink behind them, and felt the weight of what they were about to attempt. "Do you think we can win?" Maria asked, joining him at the window. Daniel considered the question carefully. He had studied warfare his entire life, from the earliest stone tools to the latest plasma weapons. He knew that victory in battle depended on more than just strength or technology. It depended on training, on tactics, on the will to fight. "They have never faced anything like us," he said finally. "They think they know what humans are capable of. They are about to learn that our history is longer and bloodier than they ever imagined." Maria nodded and returned to checking her equipment. The transport hummed around them, carrying 12 humans and 3 wooden machines toward a battle that would decide the fate of millions. Behind them, Earth turned slowly in the darkness. Ahead, the stars waited to witness something they had not seen in centuries. Humans going to war with bows and arrows just as their ancestors had done. Some things, it seemed, never truly changed. The human transport docked at station exactly 4 hours before the deadline. Commander Lisa Grant was waiting at the airlock when the doors opened, and the sight that greeted her made her heart swell with something between pride and disbelief. 12 warriors filed out, each one carrying weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum. Long wooden bows taller than some of the soldiers, heavy crossbows with iron bolts, quivers stuffed with arrows fletched with real feathers. Behind them, cargo sleds carried the disassembled components of 3 siege engines. Master Sergeant Daniel Perry stepped forward and saluted. He was a tall man with steady hands and calm eyes, the kind of person who remained unshaken no matter what chaos erupted around him. "Reporting as ordered, Commander," he said. "We brought everything we could carry." Lisa returned the salute and allowed herself a small smile. "The inspection begins in 1 hour. Are you ready?" "We are." The inspection team arrived precisely on schedule. Inspector X led them, his scales gleaming under the station lights as he approached the human equipment with obvious suspicion. He was smaller than Warlord, but no less intimidating, his eyes sharp with the certainty that he would find some violation of the treaty. "Lay out your weapons," he commanded, "all of them." Daniel nodded to his team, and they spread their equipment across the inspection bay. Longbows and crossbows were placed on tables. Arrows and bolts were arranged in neat rows. The trebuchet components were assembled just enough to show their function without being operational. X moved through the display like a predator searching for weakness. He picked up a longbow and examined it from every angle, running his claws along the wood and testing the string. He pulled an arrow from its quiver and studied the iron tip, the wooden shaft, the feathered fletching. "What is this material?" he demanded, pointing at the bowstring. "Linen," Daniel replied calmly. "Plant fibers twisted and waxed." The inspector grunted and moved to the crossbows. These received even more scrutiny. He disassembled one completely, laying out every piece on the table and checking each component against the treaty specifications. Steel prod, wooden stock, hemp string, iron trigger mechanism. No electronics, no synthetics, no chemical propellants. "These are weapons," X said accusingly. "Clearly weapons." "Yes," Daniel agreed, "but they comply with every provision of the treaty. You may check as many times as you wish." The inspector's frustration was visible in the way his scales shifted color, darkening with each piece of equipment that passed his examination. He moved to the trebuchets and spent nearly 20 minutes climbing over the wooden frames, testing the rope tensions, examining the iron fittings. "How does this work?" he finally asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Daniel walked him through the mechanism, a heavy counterweight on one end, a sling on the other. When released, the counterweight fell and the arm swung, launching whatever was in the sling toward the target. It was pure physics, gravity and leverage, nothing more. "And this can throw stones?" X asked. "Stones weighing over 200 kilograms, Daniel confirmed. "Accurately enough to hit a target the size of this room from 200 meters away." The inspector stared at the trebuchet for a long moment. Then he turned and walked to where Counselor Ma stood observing the inspection. The counselor was a member of the species, tall and graceful with silvery skin that seemed to shimmer in any light. She had been assigned to monitor the combat as a neutral observer, and her presence lent an air of formality to the proceedings. "There is no violation," X reported, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. "The human weapons comply with the treaty." Ma tilted her head, her large eyes studying the human equipment with obvious fascination. "These are historical weapons, are they not? From your species past?" Lisa stepped forward to answer. "They are. Humans used weapons like these for thousands of years before we developed more advanced technology. We have not forgotten how to make them or how to use them." "Fascinating," the counselor murmured. "I was not aware that any species maintained such knowledge." Warlord arrived at that moment, his massive form filling the doorway of the inspection bay. He surveyed the human weapons with a mixture of confusion and contempt, his yellow eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what he was seeing. "These are your weapons?" he asked, disbelief thick in his voice. "Sticks and strings." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "These sticks and strings conquered continents on our. They decided the fates of empires. They killed millions of our own kind before we learned to build anything better." A laughed, but there was less confidence in the sound than before. "Pretty words, but words do not win battles. My warriors have trained their entire lives with blade and polearm. Your museum pieces will not save you." He gestured to his own delegation, and the warriors began displaying their equipment. The weapons were impressive in their own way, massive curved swords and heavy spears forged from metals that gleamed with an inner light. They were designed for close combat, for the kind of brutal melee where they excelled. "The combat begins at dawn tomorrow," announced. "I suggest you spend the night making peace with whatever gods you worship." He turned and left without waiting for a response. His warriors followed, their heavy footsteps echoing through the station corridors. Daniel watched them go, then turned to his own team. They stood quietly among their weapons, faces calm and determined. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were historians and athletes, craftsmen and scholars, but they understood what was at stake and they were ready. "Get some rest," Daniel ordered. "Tomorrow we show them what humans can do when we stop relying on technology." Lisa walked with him back toward the human quarters, her mind turning over the possibilities of the coming battle. "Can we really win this?" she asked quietly. Daniel was silent for a moment. They have never faced projectile weapons before. They have spent centuries perfecting close combat because that is all the treaty allows. They will charge straight at us, expecting to close the distance and tear us apart. And then they will discover what our ancestors learned a very long time ago. It does not matter how strong you are or how sharp your blade is. You cannot fight what you cannot reach. Lisa nodded slowly. Tomorrow would tell if that ancient truth still held across the vast distances between stars. Tomorrow, humans would go to war with bows and arrows against an enemy that had never imagined such weapons could exist. Somewhere in the distance, the first light of Prime's sun began to touch the horizon. Dawn was coming, and with it, the proving ground. The proving ground of Prime was a valley carved by ancient rivers, its floor scattered with boulders, and its walls rising in uneven steps toward distant ridges. The morning light painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and the air was thin and cold at this elevation. Master Sergeant Daniel Perry surveyed the terrain from the human starting position at the northern end of the valley. They had assembled at the southern end, nearly 500 meters away. Between them lay open ground broken by occasional rock formations, a killing field waiting to drink its first blood in centuries. "Trebuchets on the high ground," Daniel ordered, pointing to a rocky shelf that overlooked the valley floor. "Captain, I want them operational in 10 minutes." nodded and began directing his crew to haul the siege engines into position. The trebuchets were heavy but manageable, their wooden frames creaking as they were assembled on the elevated platform. Longbows on the center line, Daniel continued. Maria, you have command of the archers. Crossbows on the flanks behind those boulder clusters. Wait for my signal before engaging. Lieutenant Maria Santos led 6 archers to their positions. They moved with practiced efficiency, stringing their bows and checking their quivers. Each archer carried 40 arrows, enough for sustained volleys if they managed their shots carefully. The crossbow teams took their positions on either side, hidden behind the rocks that dotted the valley floor. They would serve as the second line of defense if any managed to get past the arrows. Daniel took his own position beside Maria, his longbow familiar and comfortable in his hands. He had been shooting since childhood, had competed in tournaments around the world, had studied the history of archery for 3 decades, but he had never shot at a living target before. None of them had. Across the valley, they were arranging themselves for the charge. 20 warriors in total, each one standing over 2 meters tall and weighing nearly twice what a human weighed. Their scales gleamed in the morning light, and their weapons caught the sun as they hefted swords and spears with casual ease. Warlord stood at their center, his voice booming across the distance. Humans, you have chosen to face us in combat. This is your last chance to surrender with honor. Lay down your weapons and we will show mercy. Daniel did not respond. He simply raised his bow and nocked an arrow, his eyes fixed on the enemy formation. A horn sounded from the observation platform where High Arbiter and Counselor Ma watched. The combat had begun. The charged. They moved with terrifying speed, their powerful legs eating up the ground between the 2 forces. A led them, his war cry echoing off the valley walls as he raced toward the human line. They expected to close the distance in seconds, to crash into the fragile humans and tear them apart with claws and blades. Wait, Daniel said quietly. Wait. They reached 300 meters. Wait. 250 meters. The humans could see the individual scales on their faces now, the gleam of saliva on their fangs. Draw. 7 longbows creaked as they were pulled to full extension. Arrows aimed skyward at the angle Daniel had calculated the night before. 200 meters. Loose. The arrows flew in a high arc, climbing into the morning sky before curving down toward the charging enemy. They did not slow. They had no concept of what was coming, no frame of reference for projectile weapons that could reach them at this distance. The first volley struck. 3 went down immediately, arrows punching through scales and into the flesh beneath. 1 warrior fell with a shaft through his throat, another with 2 arrows in his chest. They crashed to the ground and did not rise. The charge faltered. The surviving stumbled in confusion, looking around for the source of the attack. They could not understand what was happening. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for death that came silently from the sky. Second volley, Daniel ordered. Loose. More arrows climbed and fell. 2 more dropped, one screaming as he clutched at the arrow buried in his leg. The others finally began to understand. They could not charge straight at the humans. The distance was a death sentence. A roared commands and they scattered toward the rock formations that offered cover. They were fast learners, adapting to the unexpected threat with military discipline. But adaptation took time, and time favored the humans. Daniel called, "Give them something to think about." The first trebuchet released with a deep thrum of ropes and wood. A boulder weighing nearly 200 kilograms sailed through the air in a lazy arc, seeming to hang at the peak of its flight before plummeting down, toward a cluster of rocks where several had taken shelter. The impact was devastating. The boulder shattered the rock formation and crushed 2 warriors beneath the debris. Stone splinters flew in all directions, forcing the survivors to seek new cover. "Keep firing," Daniel ordered. Maria, concentrate on any targets that break from cover. The second and third trebuchets joined the bombardment. Boulders crashed across the valley floor, demolishing hiding spots and forcing them to keep moving. Whenever a warrior emerged from cover, the archers were waiting. Arrows flew with deadly precision, finding gaps in the enemy formation. Gathered his remaining warriors behind a large rock outcropping, the only cover substantial enough to resist the trebuchet fire. From there, he assessed the situation. Of his 20 warriors, 8 lay dead or dying on the valley floor. He had not even reached the human line. The warlord made a decision. He split his remaining force into 2 groups, sending them along the valley walls where the terrain offered more protection. It was the only option. A direct charge across open ground meant death. Daniel saw the flanking maneuver developing and smiled grimly. Crossbows, prepare to engage. They are coming to you. They moved quickly, using every rock and depression for cover as they worked their way along the valley edges. They were getting closer now, inside 100 meters on both flanks. A few more seconds and they would be in melee range. The crossbow teams rose from their positions and fired. At this range, the heavy bolts were unstoppable. They punched through scales like paper, dropping warriors mid-stride. The survivors pushed forward desperately, finally close enough to use their swords and spears. A warrior crashed into the right flank position, his blade sweeping down toward a human soldier. The man dove aside, barely avoiding the strike, and his partner put a crossbow bolt through the attacker's skull at point-blank range. On the left flank, 3 reached the human line simultaneously. The fighting became brutal and close, exactly what the humans had hoped to avoid. One soldier went down with a spear through his shoulder, but the others held their ground, using their crossbows as clubs until they could reload. Maria sprinted toward the left flank, drawing her knife as she ran. She was too close to use her bow now, but she could see a raising his blade above a fallen comrade. She threw herself at him, driving her knife into the gap between his arm scales. He roared and turned toward her, giving the wounded soldier time to crawl away. Daniel released arrow after arrow, each shot finding a target in the swirling melee. He was vaguely aware of the trebuchets still firing, of crossbow bolts flying past him, of screams in 2 languages mixing in the cold morning air. And then suddenly it was over. Stood alone amid the bodies of his warriors. His chest heaved with exhaustion, and black blood dripped from a wound on his arm where an arrow had grazed him. His sword hung at his side, unused. He had never gotten close enough to swing it. The warlord looked around at the carnage, at the bodies of warriors who had never lost a ritual combat in their entire history. Then he looked at the humans, still standing behind their wooden weapons, still ready to fight. He dropped his sword. "I yield," he said, the words tearing from his throat like broken glass. The yield. Silence fell over the proving ground. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating a battlefield that would be remembered for generations to come. 12 humans with bows and arrows had defeated the mightiest warriors in the Dominion. Daniel lowered his bow and let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. They had done it. They had actually done it. The conquered chamber felt different when they returned to it. The towering crystal walls still hummed with ancient authority, and the platforms still rose toward the distant ceiling. But the atmosphere had changed. Where before there had been condescension and barely hidden amusement at humanity's predicament, there was now something closer to uncertainty, perhaps even fear. Commander Lisa Grant stood at the center of the chamber once more, but this time she was not alone. Master Sergeant Daniel Perry and Lieutenant Maria Santos flanked her, still wearing the dust and sweat of the proving ground. Behind them, the surviving members of the archery team stood at attention, their weapons carefully cleaned and displayed on a rack for all to see. High Arbiter called the assembly to order with a click of her ancient mandibles. The delegates from a dozen species fell silent, their eyes fixed on the humans who had accomplished something unprecedented. The ritual combat has concluded, announced. The Dominion fielded 20 warriors, 13 are dead, 7 surrendered. The human delegation fielded 12 warriors, 2 are wounded, none are dead. The verdict is clear, humanity has won. The words echoed through the chamber, settling into the historical record of the Galactic Concord. Lisa felt the weight of them, the significance of what her people had achieved. Warlord stood on the platform, diminished somehow despite his massive size. The arrogance that had defined him during their first encounter was gone, replaced by something more complex. He stepped forward when gestured for him to speak. "I wish to understand," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your species has plasma weapons that can burn through starship hulls. You have missiles that can crack moons, yet you defeated us with sticks and string. How is this possible?" Lisa looked at Daniel, who stepped forward to answer. "Before we learned to split atoms," Daniel said, "before we discovered electricity or chemistry, we were already at war. Humans have been killing each other for as long as we have existed as a species. The bow and arrow has been with us for over 60,000 years. We refined it through centuries of constant conflict, generation after generation, until it became one of the most effective weapons our world had ever seen." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You thought that taking away our technology would make us helpless, but technology is not what makes humans dangerous. We are dangerous because we never stop finding ways to kill. Give us plasma rifles and we will build empires. Take them away and we will reach back into our bloody history and find something else. There is always something else." Absorbed these words in silence. Then slowly he nodded. "I see now why the older species warned us about humanity," he said. "We thought you were soft, dependent on your machines. We were wrong." Counselor Ma rose from her position on the neutral observation platform. Her silver skin caught the light as she moved, and her voice carried a musical quality that contrasted sharply with the gravity of her words. "I have witnessed many things in my service to the conquered," she said, "but I have never seen anything like what happened on the proving ground today. The human warriors did not simply win. They demonstrated a depth of martial knowledge that most species have never developed. Your history is, as you say, terrifyingly educational." She turned to address the full assembly. "I move that the Concord commission a study of human military history, not to develop new weapons, but to understand what we are dealing with. It is clear that humanity is not the young, harmless species we believe them to be." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Representatives whispered to each other, casting nervous glances at the human delegation. The dynamic had shifted, and everyone present could feel it. High Arbiter restored order and pronounced the final judgment. "The disputed territory in the corridor shall remain under human control. All charges against the human mining vessels are dismissed. The Dominion will pay reparations for the costs of this proceeding. So it is judged, so it shall be." The session concluded, and the delegates began to disperse. But before they could leave, approached the human delegation one final time. "I have a request," he said, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "The Dominion has been humbled today, but we are not without wisdom. We recognize strength when we see it, and we respect those who possess it." He paused, struggling with what came next. "I wish to propose an alliance between our peoples, not out of fear but out of admiration. Your warriors fought with honor and skill. We would be proud to stand beside such fighters in the future." Lisa exchanged glances with Daniel and Maria. This was not the outcome any of them had expected. They had come prepared for war and found something entirely different waiting for them at the end of it. "I cannot speak for all of humanity," Lisa said carefully, "but I can say that we hold no ill will toward the Dominion. If you wish to pursue friendship, we will listen." I extended his clawed hand, and Lisa took it. The grip was firm but not threatening, a gesture of respect between former enemies. Daniel stepped forward and unslung his longbow from his shoulder. It was a beautiful weapon, crafted from yew wood that had been carefully aged and shaped by masters of the ancient art. He held it out to us. "Among my people there was once a tradition," Daniel said. "When warriors earned each other's respect in battle, they would exchange weapons as a sign of honor. This bow has been with me for 15 years. I would like you to have it." I took the bow with something approaching reverence. He ran his claws along the smooth wood, feeling the curve that gave it power. "I will treasure this," he said, "and I will learn to use it if you will teach me." "It would be my honor." The delegation departed, taking with them a wooden weapon and a new understanding of humanity. Other species followed, many of them pausing to look at the human equipment with fresh eyes. These simple tools had defeated warriors who were thought to be unbeatable. What else might humanity accomplish when properly motivated? Later that evening, Lisa received a communication from Earth Command. General appeared on the screen, her expression a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "I have to admit," the general said, "when you sent that message I thought you had lost your mind. Fletcher's, I had to look it up." Lisa smiled. "I remembered something from a history class. Humans spent a lot longer fighting with bows than we have spent fighting with guns. It seemed like useful knowledge." Useful is an understatement. We have already received requests from 4 other species to remove similar primitive weapon provisions from their treaties with us. Apparently, they no longer feel confident that such restrictions favor them. The irony was not lost on Lisa. The treaty had been designed to neutralize human technological advantages. Instead, it had revealed that humanity did not need technology to be dangerous. They had been dangerous long before the first circuit was ever built. The transport home departed from station the next morning. Daniel stood at the viewport once again, watching the alien world shrink behind them. Maria joined him, her wounded arm wrapped in bandages but her spirits high. "Do you think this changes anything?" she asked. "How the galaxy sees us?" Daniel considered the question. On one hand, humanity had won a minor territorial dispute through unexpected means. On the other hand, they had demonstrated something fundamental about their nature. They were not a species that could be easily contained or predicted. They were survivors, adapters, and when necessary, killers of extraordinary skill. "I think," he said slowly, "that the galaxy is starting to understand what Earth has always known. Humanity did not conquer our world through kindness. We fought our way to the top of the food chain, and we did it with weapons just like the ones we use today. Technology made us more efficient, but it did not make us dangerous. We were dangerous from the very beginning." Maria nodded and returned to her seat. The transport hummed around them, carrying them back toward a home that was just a little bit safer because of what they had done. Behind them, the stars burned cold and bright, witnesses to a truth that the galaxy was only beginning to grasp. Humanity remembered its past, all of it, including the parts that were written in blood, and when the time came, they were not afraid to use that knowledge. Some lessons, it seemed, were never forgotten.